Welcome, CADE and Torie. Thank you so much for being here. We know how busy you are, and we love you both dearly, and we are really excited to share you with our beloved community here today. So we pass the mic over to you.
Thank you for having us, Tessa. I really appreciate it. I usually let Kade start, so I'm kind of cutting in already. But I just wanted to thank you for having us, and I also just wanted to thank you for being so amazing. My students who have taken your summer course are just like totally in love. So the synergy, the bridge is amazing. So thank
The
you.
mutual love affair.
Go ahead, Kade. I always let you start. So
You always let me start. Oh man, where to start? I guess is the question. Thank you to Katie for making this feel like a normal conference sort of speaking engagement thing for sure via Zoom. So appreciate you. And yeah, and I want to leave it open as open as possible to hear questions from folks and really address sort of like what you all are thinking as young folks. I know for me personally, like I just hit the 26 mark in May, and I still feel like I'm sort of an in-betweener between like being a young person and then being like, oh, I'm 30 and I still pay taxes. I don't know if that makes me an adult yet or whatever. But just want to hear from you all, like what are some thoughts that you have regarding youth work, regarding your own personal experiences with what you are experiencing now, you know, as young folks in this country, and maybe Dr. Torie and I can sort of riff off of that, you know, and provide perspective with the work that we've been doing with other organizations that do youth development work, or with our young folks on the ground in general.
and it's better to let us know where you want to go now, because once we start talking, y'all, it's gonna.
Exactly.
Can I ask a question?
For sure.
Let me get my little video. Let's see. Hello. So a question I have, what exactly are you asking?
Just any question, you know, that pertains to youth development work, as your experience of like what's going on today, right now, as like a young person navigating these sort of systems. You know, like what are some questions that may reflect on your own development as a young person, right? That you think youth development professionals should know and do. So yeah, something along that line. Just something to get us started, you know? We want to include you all in the conversation since we're only got an hour together.
I have a question, if that's okay. So in your reading, Torie, that I read, and then also a conversation that I remember, or a comment I kind of remember you making at a staff meeting. Youth mentorship, I feel like often gets like bundled up or wrapped up with like I'm like hesitant to use the term like education reform, but like, for lack of a better word, education reform. And so I guess like my question is, how do you like toe the line of being, of not becoming like a organization that is just like treating the symptoms of like the ways in which like education is like failing us, but also like recognizing that like almost like but also recognizing the work that needs to be done in the education field. So like I feel like there's almost like this, it seems like there's this balance between like being involved because youth can like create a lot of change around that, but also not becoming like just like a tutoring course or college prep course, but like more than that. So like I'm curious in like how you guys manage that balance, I guess.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And Clayton, that was perfect. Like knowing that you have a little bit of internal knowledge about Iman, that was like the perfect question to kind of give us an opportunity to share history and everything, right? So one of my responses to that is like, even in creating the Youth Mentoring Action Network, and the co-founder is actually on somewhere here. We're both educators. We're both teaching high school. I taught high school English. She teaches music, piano, music production. But I think like one of the driving sort of elements behind starting the Youth Mentoring Action Network was being inside of a school and watching how schools function and watching the lack of care, the lack of intention, the lack of sort of critical ideas behind what was happening, right? And watching just how young people were not being handled very well, right? I went into teaching, I went into education, like sort of young, eyes wide open, like all super excited. I still look at things that I wrote when I first started teaching and I was like, oh my God, like what did I think was gonna happen as a teacher? But I went in and I was just like so excited about literature, so excited about the opportunities that I would have to unpack all of this literature and the world and society and all of that in my high school English classroom, and had no clue the bureaucratic processes, the politics, all of the things that would sort of displace my actual connection with kids, right? And so we started the Youth Mentoring Action Network, I think like 2 years after I was teaching, because it was that quickly, it was that fast, or that early on in my career that I recognized that teaching could not accomplish the things that I knew in my soul and in my heart, like I was called to do with young people, right? I recognized immediately that like I couldn't spend time with young people in the ways that I needed to. I was in a situation where there was 38 students in a class. I had them for 55 minutes a day. So, you know, it was like 180 kids and for a year. And it was just too easy for them to get lost. And then by the time we got in, we kind of went through all of the stuff we were supposed to go through, attendance and all the administrative stuff. It was like, we got a good 20 minutes. If you were like, and I was a new teacher, right? So that was like, it's 20 minutes, like probably when I was 7 years in. When I was new, it wasn't even 20 minutes, right? But when I was 7 years in, it was like a good 20 minutes of like, let's unpack this literature and like, let's really do some deep work. But I was frustrated immediately because I just didn't have the opportunities to do what I needed. And so I started just like looking at like, what are the options? Like what are ways that you can engage young people, but outside of schools? Because schools ain't it, like that, they're not gonna cut it. And that's when I kind of stumbled across mentoring. And I was like, okay, now this is a concept. Like I can do this. Like this is something where you're building a relationship with a young person. Like it's a long-term, it's more concentrated. Like there are goals attached to it that aren't purely academic. And so then I was kind of like, okay, now we're getting somewhere, right, with mentoring. Then from there, I realized that there was even some issues with mentoring. Like, so as I started studying mentoring, I started seeing it was very hierarchical. Like, here's an adult, here's a young person. The adult tells the young person like, hey, I have all the wisdom, I'm gonna give that to you, right? Like it wasn't even a choice for the young person, which was kind of problematic for me. It was very Eurocentric. It was like the way mentoring is still marketed is very like white middle-class person comes into the hood, like rescues Black and brown children. So that was a critique, but I still felt like the heart of it, like the building relationship component, was the powerful piece that could be replicated. And that if we just kind of couple that with, as CADE said in the chat, with critical theories that were thinking like more critically about race, class, gender, sexuality, like something could be done. And even though like I was looking at the research, young people had to teach me that lesson. So like I always tell the story how I set up a mentoring program the first year. Like I read all the research, all the best practices guides, set up a program that was rooted in my middle classness, like totally like academic outcomes and expectations. And at the end of the first year, asking young people for feedback and them being like, like this ain't it, this ain't popping, right? And then just kind of like trying to be humble enough to think about, okay, let me put myself in their shoes and ask them like, what makes sense for them? And this is when like a lot of the school issues that I was already frustrated with, like started coming out from young people, like them saying, we get talked at all the time about our academics. Like, yes, academics are important, but it's not the most important thing. Like I'm a whole person. There are other things that I want support, guidance around. It can't just always be academics. So that was one. And then the other thing was like, even in relationship to academics, you're not looking at context. Like you're telling me go to math class, be good in math class, get there on time, get a good grade, but you're not thinking about the terrible relationship that I have with my teacher, or the fact that like this teacher is committing microaggressions and like I don't feel safe in that class. You're just telling me get over it and go with it, right? So young people brought up all of the different sort of nuances that we needed to consider, which was like, I'm a whole person, academics aren't everything, and I'm looking for someone I can trust, someone that will guide me, and someone who won't just kind of do what every other adult does in my life, right? And so a lot of the critical components, even though we could find them in critical race theory, like young people naturally just said, like, I'm dealing with issues of race, I'm dealing with all of these different things, and they're impacting the way that I show up every day. And so I need a mentor to help me navigate that, not a mentor that's just gonna say what, you know, again, what most structures dealing with young people say, which is like, eat your oatmeal, you know, like just deal with it. Oh, that teacher's a jerk. Everyone has teachers that are jerks. Like, deal with it. You know, you have to just get over it because she already has her degree. You know, sort of like all the typical like adult things that we say to kids. They were just like, no, it's beyond that. Like, I need someone to help me navigate, someone to empower me, someone to support me when I do kind of like fight back against things that are happening. And so young people really taught me how to mentor. And taught me how to think about, okay, this is mentoring, this is schooling. They're two different things. They might overlap, they might connect in some ways, but they're two different things. And one of the things that I always say to adults, Clayton, about like the separation of things is, like, as a teacher, I'm an authority figure. I'm in charge. Like, at the end of the day, even if I want to be student-centered and all that and all of those things, at the end of the day, like, I'm an authority figure. Like, I have control of the classroom. I get to dictate how people move. A mentor is not necessarily an authority figure, right? Like, I don't get to tell kids what to do as a mentor. I don't get to say, like, you need to do this homework. You need to like spend 15 minutes working on that. You need to read this. Like, my job as a mentor is to be much more collaborative, much more in partnership, right? Much more of a model, a coach. There's a different feel to it, right? And then because there's a different feel to it, then there's also, for me, more of like, I wouldn't say allowance, but there's more of a freedom to partner than there is as a teacher. As a teacher, at the end of the day, like, I'm held accountable by administrators, right? So like, I have to get things done. As a mentor, there's much more flexibility in that relationship, which allows for more freedom dreaming, you know, allows for more collaborative effort, allows for more growth opportunities, I think, because it isn't limited and it isn't being dictated by anybody else except for the two people or few people who are engaged in it, right? And I've talked a lot, so Connie, I'm sure you have some things that you want to add to this too.
That was everything, but yeah, Clayton, to go on, right? I think and to discuss sort of the complexities that like Dr. Torie brings up with sort of this youth development world is that there's like all these inherent issues with education, right? And I see like Iman as like in opposition to sort of the traditional hierarchical like relationships that have sort of been developed or exist within the mentoring field within the US. And you bring up Dr. Torwiesen's book, which is Critical Mentoring, a Practical Guide. And she talks about that in there, right? This sort of history of mentoring in the United States, which was like this sort of big brothers, big sisters model, right? And everything, and how it was more designed for like latchkey kids, right? So latchkey kids are like these kids that are sort of running around the neighborhood, right? They don't have parents to look after them because their parents are working like 18-hour jobs that we luckily don't have to do anymore, right? Due to unions and all that stuff, right? And so there's that history there, and with that became this sort of authoritarian, like sort of mentor figure, right? And in the 80s, right, you had this huge culmination of like the war on drugs, right? And like going into Black and brown communities, right? And saving these Black and brown kids and everything from themselves, et cetera. And this is sort of still the system that we sometimes operate within or sometimes engage within the field of mentoring. And it's difficult because I think, you know, going back to what I mentioned in the chat is that a lot of organizations or a lot of folks, especially in the United States, haven't worked as much elsewhere, but we tend to think with this the symptoms mentality, right? It's like, cool, if we get a mentor in there, we can get these kids to do their homework. We can get these kids to not do drugs. They can dare to say no, and everything's going to be fine. But that's really not the case. And there is research that shows like, okay, if you do put mentors into certain positions, you reduce risky behaviors, right? So kids are less likely to drop out, like yada, yada, all this stuff. But like, what I really appreciate Dr. Torwiesen's and like me starting up with the Youth Mentoring Action Network was, okay, cool, that stuff's important, but we can sort of naturally talk about that stuff as that, stuff comes along. But what's sort of the things in between the cracks that we're not seeing, right? And a lot of this, to bring up a solid example of what Dr. Wiesen was talking about, was our mental health approach and our wellness collaborative work, where our young folks basically told us, and so we have young folks on our board, we have young folks on our staff, that basically tell us what to do. And like my coworker and I, Isabella, like we sort of joke around with them, like, we kind of work for you. Like, yeah, Dr. Torie Wiesen signs our checks, but really at the end of the day, like y'all are kind of dictating to us like what needs to happen on the ground. And so a lot of our young folks were telling us, mental health is a huge issue. And then all of us at Iman were like, well, none of us are mental health, practitioners. We can't really do that work. And I think that's where a lot of other organizations like fall into, right? Is like, we don't have that expertise, so why would we do that? But the way that we started to think about it, and that's like applying these critical theories and the things that you're probably learning at Pitzer College right now, right? Is like, cool, I have this understanding, so maybe I can create a sort of mental health, program, right? Where I just pull together a bunch of other critical minded LMFTs, if they exist in the community that you serve, right? And bring them together to hopefully serve these groups, this group of young folks, right? To talk about what it means to be a Black girl in America today, to talk about what it means to be an undocumented, young person in Trump's America, to talk about like all these really, anxiety ridden things, or even just trauma at home, right? Or the stress and anxiety of what it means to always be talked at about your grades. And sort of break that down on, using mentoring, right? To connect folks to other like, amazing, beautiful networks or programs that exist within your community, and sort of just be that opportunity broker is what we heard. Me and my coworker, Isabella, we heard this in another training the other day that talked about being an opportunity broker, right? That's what mentoring really should be about. And it takes a sort of critical or cultural competence to do that correctly, right? So you're not just assigning someone to a social clinical worker and you're like, oh, cool, that's going to fix everything, right? But then there's a whole trauma and a whole history of why a social clinical worker is a bad thing for communities of color in some regards, right? So it's like it's bringing all these things together and developing ways in which we're supporting young folks, we're making them feel safe, and they're able to like just be themselves and feel that they can be themselves without this sort of pressure, or anxiety, or these other things that really impact their development and create more caring, competent adults.
I think one of the things like I always reiterate to folks, because people think mentoring is so sort of simplistic, right? And I think that, again, that's a lot of the way that we market it. But what I remind folks is that doing the work of really understanding context, the context that young people exist in, really the context we all exist in, but I think as we get older and older, we adapt to, right? But I think really thinking about that is not just about making it better for the young person per se, but like the approach of critical race theory in particular gives us a more streamlined opportunity to do liberation work, right? Like, so for example, like we talk a lot in Youth Mentoring Action Network about being youth-centric, and people love the concept of youth-centrism. They're always like, okay, I can do that. Like we can put a young person on our board. Like that's that's easy. That's something that's like very attainable, right? But then I remind people that being youth-centric is not like, it's not divorced from critical race theory work. Like the whole point of being youth-centric is to say, particularly to communities that don't have voice, power, and choice, like the ownership everything about this organization belongs to you, right? And so people kind of see the youth-centric aspect and some of the like mentoring aspects that we talk about, they kind of view them in this simplistic way. And a lot of our work is to say, but it isn't simple. If you're working in marginalized communities with folks who traditionally don't have voice, power, and choice, with people who traditionally see programs, especially members of the nonprofit industrial complex, come in, write these like really terrible need statements in their grants about how crappy their communities are, right? And then get money to just like do things to them, sort of understanding the concept that really thinking about this in a critical way means ensuring that the young people in their communities are part of what you're building, or have as much stake in what's happening as you do. One of the quotes that I always use when we're training is from James Baldwin, and it says, I am not the object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Right. And we always use that in our trainings to remind folks, like, you're not a savior. You're not saving anyone. These folks, like the communities that we are working alongside are folks that have existed in the face of white supremacy, folks that continue to be resilient, through not having access to resources, whether that be health and wellness resources, food resources, economic resources. Like, America has collectively as a society completely thrown whole communities away, and they are still here and still surviving and attempting to thrive in a lot of situations. So when you set up a nonprofit, especially a mentoring youth serving program, and you're like, let me save kids, that is a problematic frame, right? Like, these communities have not only resilience, but lots of wealth and lots of information, lots of resources that have actually carried them this far. And so we need to like shift our ideas about what it means to be of service to these communities. And that's why we tend to at Iman use words like partnership and collaboration and building together and freedom dreaming together. And I use words like alongside, right? Because my purpose is not to go into communities and dictate to them, oh, this is what we think you need based on like readings we've done in these predominantly white academic institutions. Like, my job is to say, like, we are all a member of this community, and we are looking, actually, let's identify goals together. Not like, we're looking to accomplish the same thing. Like, let's identify things together that need to be done, and then let's build that together, right? And for us, that means definitely working with young people who we sincerely believe are the future, not just like in a literal sense of like, you're young now and you're going to be older later, but we really do believe that young people are the future. And I think my Afro sensibilities too, like just as a Black woman, I'm constantly reminded of the Black women in my community, but just my community in general, that carried me as a young person, right? That encouraged me, that told me I could do things, that told me I could be things, that told me, like, you don't have to go outside of our community to find what you're looking for, right? Folks who just, even in little ways, gave me a leg up or made a phone call for me or any of those types of things. And I want to be that, right? Like, I want to be that elder for who's coming after me. I feel it's my responsibility to not only do that individually, but to build space, to build an organization that is dedicated to this, right? In order to continue to sustain the power of our communities. And I just think that, again, I always like to sort of make explicit this concept that, like, it seems people say mentoring and they're like, cool, like you just meet with a young person, like y'all hang out, everything is great. But like for us, there is a lot of thought that goes into how do we build a relationship that makes sense for young people? How do we not only speak their language, but how do we ensure that young folks, especially those, who are Black, who are brown, who are queer, who are disabled, right? Like the whole range, how do they feel freest? How do they feel most liberated? How do we set up that space? How do we encourage them to continue to fight for that? Like, how do we remind them that where they came from is powerful and wonderful, and that all of those assets and that energy and that skill set is in them, right? How do we remind them of who their ancestors are on a daily basis? They're battling spaces that like marginalize them. That's our role, is to be the most loving, sustaining, imaginative, empowering space possible for young people.
Definitely. And Aaron, you asked the question, right? And it's in the chat for folks to check out. But I think this is a good segue. So like, Dr. Torie certainly laid out like, okay, cool, communities of color, like we got stuff, right? Like we know things, there's things inherently in our neighborhood, in our knowledge that have led to our survival. So hopefully we can use those things and start to like pivot and sort of thrive, right? Instead of just continuously trying to survive. And I think that's what a lot of abolition work has done. And Dr. Bettina Love, who we've worked with in the past too, discusses this a lot in her books called like, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive, right? And Aaron, you asked a good question about like, okay, cool. So there's all this knowledge, there's all these beautiful things going on, but at the same time, there's also a lot of toxicity and things that can exist within communities of color, within like sort of white liberal communities, whatever the case may be, right? Sort of, there's always going to be some negatives that exist, right? And this is where at Iman we utilize like this sort of concept of context, right? So we don't prescribe or write out these things that say like, this is how it works 100% of the time. So just utilize this model, implant it in Louisiana, implant it in, you know, Phoenix, implant it in Montana, implant it on New York or Albany, wherever. We're not saying that. So it's not just using these like critical frameworks and saying like, once you do that, you're going to have a great mentoring program. It's hard work, and there's continuously issues that keep coming up, right? And even for myself, I can speak from like the Latinx community I grew up within, which I was like the only Mexican family on the block in the Central American neighborhood, right? And no one in my household was teaching me sort of this, like I mentioned, Latinx white supremacy was mentioned in my bio, right? But I sort of like the way I look, my skin color, right? I am white passing, but once I get into white spaces, people are always like, wait, so what are you again? Like, where are you from? Where's your family from, right? So I get that question all the time, right? But sort of these ideas and these systems sort of implanted in me this idea that like I might be better than the folks that come from my same community, right? I could speak English a particular way. I don't have citizenship issues. I don't have these things, right? Which can impact me negatively and make me look at my neighborhood negatively too, right? So that's like one example. But Aaron, you're bringing up like homophobia, right? And like the issues that homophobia can arise in within any household in the United States or anywhere in the world, right? And so it's looking at the context of that young person and where they're growing up and sort of like the larger context of society, right? And saying like, cool, we do live in a homophobic society. Things have gotten a lot better, but at the same time, right, there's been sort of these recent developments and like rights for the gay community and the LGBTQ community and everything. And I am by no means an expert on that community and stuff, but thinking about the context of that young person's development, like isolation is like the one thing that is just horrible for a young person across the board. I think for anybody, right? So even if we're not like clashing with the values that are going on in that household or whatever, what we can do as mentors is like just be, as Torie was saying, like be as supportive, be as empowering, be as collaborative, be as partnering as we can be to connect them to other sort of, you know, communities that do support them and do see them, you know, as a whole human being and don't have these sort of negative values attached to them, right? And hopefully, like, you know, eventually maybe there's a conversation that can happen with that family, like eventually down the road or something. But, you know, by and large, we know the reality that there's just these horrible instances and these traumas and all these things that happen in our communities as well. But hopefully we're doing something in the meantime and utilizing mentoring to connect folks to folks, right? And that might mean, you know, partnering with an LGBTQ resource center in that community. Maybe it's a regional center, unfortunately, because there's nothing in that small town or whatever, or even in that city, depending on, you know, if it tends to be more conservative, more liberal, whatever the case may be, or just finding like just other folks in the community that have gone through like what that young person is going through, right? You're not really imposing anything on that young person, but you're hopefully creating more opportunities for them to navigate, to not feel isolated, not feel alone, and utilizing mentoring in that way, if that makes sense.
And I'd also add to that as well that, you know, just this is as a teacher, like as someone who's just studied education and youth development as well, there is no such thing as not clashing. Like, you know, one of the things is we, you know, our primary sort of group that we work with are teenagers. And that is like the time in a young person's development where they clash with their families, right? Like if we didn't exist, they would still do it, right? Because we all know that at that age, that's when we're starting to sort of like form our own thoughts and opinions about things, reconcile what we've learned in different areas and try to figure out like what that means for us. Are we, you know, we were raised Christian, but do we really believe that? Like this is that time in all of our growth, like where we start having those clashes anyway, right? So some of it is more deep-seated, Aaron, as you referred to, in terms of like homo antagonism and just for the record, like I use homo antagonism, not homophobic, because I don't think you're scared. I think you're a jerk. So that's why I use homo antagonism. But just my term, you don't have to subscribe to that. But like, yeah, like some of it could be a little more deep-seated, you know, in terms of like being raised with those kinds of values. But, you know, some of it is also just typical sort of youth development and young people being at the age where they're questioning things and coming into their own, right? And I think as long as we are creating spaces where young people have the opportunities to unpack that, because I think that's really the key. It's not about dictating like you're wrong, right? Obviously, I do agree that, you know, folks who are homo antagonistic are wrong, but with young people especially, and I think this is why this is my call, because I don't have this level of patience with adults. But with young people especially, I feel like this is your opportunity. Like I tell people, young people all the time, like, this is the time to fail. Like you're at the safest time in your life. You're in safe, if you're in a place like Iman or at a place like Iman, you're in a safe place, like physically, right? Literally. This is the time for you to figure out what that is and what that means, right? So if you've been dealing with some of these things at home all of your life and you're at this point where you're trying to reconcile, do I agree? Do I not agree? Like what new evidence or information do I need to use to sort of unpack all of these things? Our job is just to create the space for you to do that, right? And to provide as much support as we can while you're doing that, right? Now, obviously, there are some like definite, and Aaron mentioned it, like, how do we keep other kids safe? Like, we definitely have sort of a natural process in place where folks, like young folks, understand that when they come into our space, their space, right? Like this is a space where everyone is coming in and we're all like sort of centered on building and loving, right? And I think that because we set up that space already, the young people come knowing, okay, this is what I'm going to get. And this is also on some level what I have to give, right? And I've seen it naturally happen. Like we had an IE Youth Summit, was it last week? I feel like it was just, the time is blending and COVID, but it happened just last week and the summit was over and it was kind of like, all right, everybody break, but no one left. The young people just started talking to each other. And the talking was not like, oh yeah, we're still talking about health and wellness or whatever our policy platforms. It just became a support area. Like someone just out of nowhere said, oh, I've been wanting to build this. And then young people are like, oh, like other young people just responding, oh yeah, yes, like you should do that, sis. Like you would be good at it. Let me help you like build this resource, or like, I know this person or I know that person. So like we come in with the energy of building a space that does that, right? And then young people just sort of unpack these things together, right? With us saying like, here's some frameworks, here's some ideas, you know, here's our intention. Definitely there's an equity and justice filter, like with everything we do, right? But the young people match that energy, right? And then they come in being loving, supportive, affirming of each other, almost to like, they don't really need us. Like we've just created the space again, right? And they're doing it for one another. And then I also just wanted to, and thank you, Tessa, for raising this, like just continue to invite y'all to ask questions. You can just ask them in the chat. We'll answer as we go, or you could like raise your hand. Is it Rosalina? All right, sis, I see you. Actually, let me correct myself. All right, fam, I see you. I got to stop using gender and assuming gender. So, okay, fam, what you got for us?
Well, I was reading your book, and I do identify as she, her, her, so. As I was reading your book, I was reflecting a lot on like my past engagement with like youth spaces, and throughout middle school and high school, I was in a youth group at my church, at my local Catholic church. And I ended up having like a really big fallout of it with the youth leader because of their like denial to center youth voices. And like it ended in this really like bad argument. And I was like, I cannot be here anymore if you cannot like center youth voices. Like they just had this structure in place that was like just telling us what to do, what to engage in, and like really had little input. And like when they did ask us for input, it was like, okay, yeah, we'll consider it. And like, then not really. So I'm wondering if you have any like thoughts on like how to radicalize those spaces, like if that is even a possibility, because they're already existing and they already have this large engagement in these like low income neighborhoods with like Black and brown people. So like, how do we use these spaces to like start engaging this type of like critical theory and conversations that already exist, if that's even possible?
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna jump on that real quick. Torie, yeah, so I grew up in the Catholic tradition. I went to Catholic school for like pretty much my whole life, except when I got to community college and then was at Pitzer and everything. which made me miss the secular life a little bit, funny enough. But thinking about that question in particular, Rosalina, like, you know, that's what's so crazy to me is like how diverse and how crazy the Catholic like sort of diaspora can be, right? And how people like approach that work within that sort of like space. Because like for me, like I had a great, you know, we had a really young brother. So we had the Christian Brothers as part of like our high school and stuff like that. And he was younger. So he had just graduated from like our high school, joined the Brotherhood to become a teacher, etc. And so he already was like inherently like, I guess, a young person in his mind still, because he was like the youngest person in the whole Brotherhood, right? So he very much brought that approach to like engaging with young folks, right? And so that was kind of like the perfect storm situation for him, like to come in and still like have that perspective. But I know it is like, and that's what he does, and that's a lot of his like West Coast work, is he's trying to change those spaces to really, and he calls it vocational learning. So there is like sort of a thing that exists within the church right now, depending on like whatever, you know, sect, I guess, is working within the school that you might have gone to and everything. But this in particular is the Christian Brothers, where he's really trying to change that. And it's supposed to be like more engaging young folks to really pull out like, what can they get from the church, or what can they get from like, you know, the programming that exists to do service work. Because I mean, that was like an important part of my upbringing, I guess, was like to get the exposure to social justice work, you know, even though it was like very volunteer based and everything, there's still a lot of problems and things that need to be worked out within that field. But that is happening to kind of give some hope. But you know, we haven't been contacted by church groups very much in the past. I know a lot of my technical training assistance work probably isn't going to come around that, and maybe that has to do with sort of the critical race theory and the critical like queer theories and things that like sort of we're more comfortable with, that maybe like you know, more religious like spaces aren't yet. But eventually, I mean, we are more than happy to work with those folks, right? And we like, I will positively, I'm still a Catholic and a practicing Catholic. I got my Santa around my neck and everything, right? So I'm down with it. And I still believe that there's a lot, like my faith is like a part of this work and got me to the place that I'm, you know, I'm at. So hopefully we have more like critical young folks that go back into those spaces and teach at Catholic schools or engage different, different schools that are Catholic, right? That have a population of young folks that are connected in these spaces and everything. And hopefully we see a growth on that side, but we're here, we're waiting, we're willing. If the Catholic Church hits us up, if the Pope, you know, comes over, is like, hey, we like what Iman's doing, I'll be like, hey man, we got you, bro. Like, it's all good. Like, we're going to work with you, you know? But I think like when those spaces start to open up and start to include like more of those critical theories, I think we'll see a lot more wide reaching change in that space. But definitely, like, and I think it comes down to you too. That's what I wanted to get at. Is it comes down to you too to maybe go back and see if that person sort of left the space, or to talk to other folks, right? That you can kind of come back and like engage and sort of like rework and rethink what that curriculum looks like to better engage young folks, you know? And it will really come down to you going back to that school maybe. And, you know, even if there was like traumatic, hopefully that person's not there anymore, but hopefully there's like someone else, you know, that you can sort of work with and think about these things and say, you know, and use your positionality, right? As a college graduate, as like, you know, utilize your networks and things, right? And come back into the community and serve it better.
I also think too, like the more institutions are sort of rooted in hierarchy and authority, which I think a lot of our religious institutions are, it's hard for them, right? Because for them, it very much is like about like an order of things, right? And so I think there's some of that. I think there's also some of like, a lot of it is just plain adultism. Like that's one of the things I have to talk to adults about all the time, is just not really realizing that in terms of positionality, like as adults, we're just accustomed to giving orders to folks who are younger than us, right? And we don't always consider, like I'm always reminding adults, think about where you were at 15, 16, 17, like think about what you wanted from school, from mentoring, from church, from wherever, like whatever spaces you were in, right? I think we have to just remind adults that young people are their own beings, right? And that they have thoughts and feelings and ideas. And it sounds basic because I feel like we here are all clear on that, but think about how much of the world operates with the assumption that like certain groups of people just aren't going to be at the decision-making table, right? And so young people are always just like, yeah, we just dictate to them. Like they're not when they grow up, they'll have a say, right? It's just kind of how we think about young people. And so it really is just a sort of transformation, a paradigm shift, and how adults have to think that, you know, young people, and I remind myself even by just saying, like, young people are coming after me. Like, young people are going to be doing this work shortly thereafter. And if I'm doing a good job, like, faster, like sooner than later, right? And then reminding myself of, like, how do I best prepare them? And I don't prepare them by dictating to them all the time, structuring everything so that they don't have any decision-making capability. Like, one of the frustrations about being a high school teacher was always like, these kids spend 6 hours of their day just being dictated to. And then they turn 18 and we go, okay, go into the world, like, vote, start paying bills and make decisions. How in the world? They haven't learned how to think. They haven't learned how to do those things for themselves. And as adults, again, as a role, as an elder role, like, I keep reminding myself, it's my job to train them to be free thinking, you know, critically thinking individuals. And if I'm not giving them opportunities for practice, I'm not a good teacher. I'm not a good elder, right? Like, I'm not doing the things that I need to do to bring the young people, like, into that, like, whatever we want to see them do in the you know, as they come of age.
And Boz, you bring up a good point, because you know, in the chat, Lila, you asked, you know, is there a definition for young person, young people? And I guess the working definition right now is, like, you know, anyone that's basically like a child to like 25, I think is like the cutoff, which is why I say I'm like in that in-betweener space, you know, the 26. And I mean, you know, young folks go through that, right? Like, high school folks, I was like, you know, Torie was saying, like, oh, Lila, my mistake, Lila, my bad. I go through it too. I always get called Katie at the, you know, at the Starbucks down the street and everything. But anyways, so yeah, but thinking about, like, you know, what a young person is, right? It tends to be that 25, and, you know, young folks, like, at the high school age, right? Going from having to raise their hand to use a restroom to, like, okay, cool, now choose what you're going to do for the next 30 to 40 years, right? You know, in the span of like just a few months. Like, you all, like, in the college space are probably going to go through that too, if you're at that sort of 18 to 22, you know, age range, right? When you exit college, like, that doesn't end when you enter the professional world either. Like, I was just at a conference, I think last year, doing some of our like grant work and everything. It was interesting because, like, I was sitting in the space, I was 24 at the time, I think, or 25, something like that. And someone just straight up said, like, an adult in the room, you know, it was like maybe in their 40s, was like, yeah, you know, it's so interesting how we don't think, like, drugs still impact young people, and, like, your brain isn't fully developed even, you know, until you're 25 or until you're 28 or something like that. And said that, like, just blatantly in front of me as, like, the only young person in the room. And I just had to, like, raise my hand and address that, like, yo, this is like a form of adultism in this space, right? Because, like, adults make mistakes at the same, you know, rate as young people do, right? Like, why do you say my brain isn't developed? I'm here in this room with y'all. Like, you know, there's like how many other like 40, 50-year-olds here in this room, and I'm the youngest person. Like, so it's this interesting like culmination of like young and adults and elders and stuff like that. But at the crux of it, hopefully we're all just creating spaces where we can collaborate, right? There isn't this sort of judgment or this expectation that young folks like don't know or anything. You know, because we're learning, right? And I think college is sometimes, or that sort of post-high school period, is where we're just sort of thrown into it and we have to figure it out. And that's where a lot of like really interesting lessons, mistakes, failures, all these crazy things, you know, go down, and stuff like that. But yeah, how do we like sort of mesh youth development work into all these spaces so we're always constantly creating safe spaces for young folks to enter is super critical. But yeah.
And that's really our number one goal, is to disrupt spaces so that young people can come in and do what they do best, which is build, like, I think, even more innovative spaces. And I saw the question too in the chat about in my freedom dreams, which, you know, that's been like a theme of my podcast. Like, I've been asking every person that I interview, like, in your freedom dreams, what does the future of youth work look like? You know, for me, I hate to say it, and this is like really terrible, and probably a lot because of our work is just dealing with like trying to help adults get out of the way of young people. But I feel like my freedom dream has a lot more to do with adults than young people, because I already have this sort of basic faith that young people are gonna be amazing, Not that they don't need guidance or support, but I just have this basic faith that like young people are already helping us to see the world in ways that, you know, adults have lost, right? As sort of we age. So for me, the freedom dream is for adults to figure out how can we best show up for young people so that they can do their work. That's for me, like in my freedom dream, it's having adults be aware enough to say, where can I be a good elder and support young people? But then how do I also get out of the way so that young people can build the dream, the freedom dream that like is best, right? Because I feel that's the challenge, is like young people are coming with a natural curiosity. They're natural revolutionaries in a lot of ways. Young people like don't have problems wrapping their heads around using pronouns and things like that. Like young people kind of come with okay, like I was just on the phone with my sister today, and my nephew, who is, I think, just turned 5. He was playing at the park, met another kid, and I guess the kid was a Spanish speaker. And so I could hear like him in the background, like I could hear them trying to navigate this new friendship, like at the park. And my sister was like almost in tears because she says, William just met a kid at the park and found out that the kid doesn't speak English. And his response was, wow, that's so cool. Like, and then they just started playing, right? Like there was no problem. He was just like, wow, you're different. That's amazing. Like, I like this, let's explore, right? And I feel like young people are like that until we school that out of them, right? Until society says like, oh no, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to kind of play in this box, you have to behave this way. And so for me, my freedom dream is that adults get enough consciousness to recognize that young people have that freedom dreaming ability that hasn't been taken from them yet, that hasn't been stolen from that yet. And if we can just figure out a way to bring our wisdom to the table and not sort of beat kids over the head with it, but say like, here was my experience, this is what I learned, this is what I understand to be true, take this and do what you will, right? Like I always say, like we're the original song and then we give it to the kids and the kids do the remix. Like that's always the example, right? So for my freedom dream, it's that adults figure that out, right? Is that we figure out how to best leave the real work in the hands of young people, but like surrounding them with the wisdom and the support that they need.
Definitely. And there's a long question in the group chat, and thank you for throwing that in there. I love it. There's all kinds of dopeness in there. So yeah, basically to address that, it is a jam board for sure. You know, Torie usually sends me out. It's like, CADE, go forth and spread the gospel according to me to engage with all these, you know, organizations to do youth work and everything. And I think this question right here is the crux of that. We tend to always, like I always throw in and pepper in our trainings, like on critical mentoring or mentoring 101 or LGBTQ stuff, but all the sort of things that we engage these organizations to do. We always sprinkle in like the fact that you should have young people on your board, right? You should, you know, start to pay young folks for their expertise if you're having listening sessions or sort of like, you know, bringing young folks to like implement things. You know, yeah, no, you're good for that. It's a good question. But implementing like youth really into the organization, but then when they enter those spaces that you're not sort of like how I mentioned, right? When I entered that space, even as a 26-year-old or 23-year-old, whatever I was, with like, you know, a master's degree and a bachelor's degree, that I'm still sort of being seen as a young person, or like people say things that like, and not realize, you know what I mean? Like, oh, these, you know, and that tends to happen to a lot of young folks when they do enter board spaces, right? They're like, oh, so what do you think, right? And then all of a sudden you speak for the youth of America at that point, right? Or the youth in that service region, right? And so to break those things down realistically is like, as Torie's been mentioning, you know, is to really think and collaborate, right? Ask young people what they want, what makes them feel more comfortable, and knowing that that takes time. That doesn't take like 1 week, you know, you don't have just one like 8-hour conversation, then it's fixed, right? It's a process that takes a lot of time that I think a lot of people aren't interested in participating in currently for whatever reason, right? Because you got grant, you know, cycles ending, you got like all these like sort of you know, academic institution, nonprofit-y things that go on that sort of disrupt you from just sort of the relationship piece that is really important to this work. And a lot of organizations forget that, you know, and to help hold them accountable, I think is hard, right? I think it really takes a certain leader or a certain person, right, to be in that institution or in that space that is like really looking at this as a core issue and is doing everything in their power to make sure to hold it accountable essentially within their own organization, right? There's no outside agency that's going to be able to regulate that or do anything. It's really got to come within. But once again, it takes time. I think there has been a sort of growth in organizations considering youth boards. Even within San Bernardino County, there's a youth advisory council that meets, right, to discuss issues that go on within the county, which is great. And it's something like 50 young folks that are on that. You know, the sort of things that get worked out within the relationship side or making sure that young folks feel that they're truly a part of this process, right, still probably need to be worked out. But to start to see those things, I think is a good sign. And then that should like echo out to all of you all, if you want to do youth development work, right, to really partner with those organizations or those entities that are really sort of implementing those things on the ground and making those things happen. But yeah, boss, did you want to?
I think, you know, for me, and this could probably be just like a whole hour in and of itself, because I got lots of critiques after teaching for 15 years about these institutions and what needs to happen with them, right? But I think that this is the shorter answer would be, this is one of the reasons why I have become an abolitionist, right? And CADE already mentioned like us being sort of students of Dr. Bettina Love's work in some respect, but also just like history, right? My ancestors being abolitionists in a lot of ways, your ancestors being abolitionists in a lot of ways, and recognizing that like at this point, and I've recognized this more clearly than ever because of COVID. And some of my students are on here, they've heard me say this. COVID has exacerbated all of the terrible things about these institutions, right? And this is also, though, one of our really powerful opportunities to say, like, we need to be abolitionists in full effect. So giving schools, for example, which at this point, I can be just really 100% transparent and say, like, I detest, like, I don't think schools should exist. I think they need to just go away and we need to build something new. We need a freedom dream about something new. These institutions weren't meant to serve us, to serve the young people that Iman focuses on. The reason why Iman exists and the reason why Iman thrives as an organization is because of the failure of schools, because of what schools cannot do for young folks of color, for queer folks, right? These institutions won't shift. They've shown us that what they do is they just adapt, right? They go from suspending kids in person to suspending kids online. They go from, you know, the school to prison nexus in like literally in a physical building to school to prison nexus online, right? Like calling police and having on people like in their own homes, right? Like doing these kinds of things. Going to people's homes with the school resource officer and tagging their door if they're absent too much from online school. Like these places will adapt. These places will still do the same harm that they intended to do in person, right? So for me, this is proof that there needs to be abolition. This is proof that these institutions will not shift, that what we have to do as abolitionists is not only start to dismantle these institutions, divest and then dismantle these institutions, but at the same time, in the spirit of our ancestors, also freedom dream and rebuild. Like we don't have the privilege to do one or the other. We have to divest from and be building something else that is free, that is liberatory, that suits us, that loves us back. We have to be doing that at the same time. So for me, I don't focus my work on shifting these systems as much as I focus my work on building something new, to give folks something that they can go to when they do divest. Because I'm at this moment where I'm thinking to myself, we're on the cusp of something. COVID has already created these issues, but then on top of creating these issues, folks are starting to figure out that these systems aren't going to work. And so where are they going to go once they've wrap their heads around this, where are they going to go? And so for me, like one of my new iterations of Iman is to create a space for them to come to, or multiple spaces that might be necessary. So, you know, for me, it's about freedom dreaming. What's next?
Oh my gosh, I don't want to even try to stop this conversation because I just want to live in this conversation. I want us all just to stay here together and live in this conversation for a lot longer. But I think there might be other things like eating or classes or work that people have to get to. So we'll have to continue the conversations in our hearts. I'm going to try to wrap up some things here because I was really touched, Torie and CADE, by, first of all, the way you guys weave together your comments and the story and the narrative you create is beautiful. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And I really appreciate that you guys were able to do with the Jamboard of the chat and the people's questions and people's voices interwoven with that, which of course is how you do everything, youth-centric, bringing people in, collaborative conversation, right? So, you know, we've been thinking in this class and in our program a lot about healing justice and racial justice. And I love that even without even saying those terms in particular, you guys wove in, you know, racial justice is connected to many other different justices, which is very much at the root of critical mentoring and critical pedagogy and critical thinking, right? And so you all are building this, as you said so beautifully right now, you know, what we're tearing down and what we're building up, where we're divesting and where we're recreating, and the imaginative, loving, power building, sustaining a space is the way to navigate that justice, right? Inside and outside the systems. And the healing justice to me came through so strong. Torie, you were talking about our elders, right? And being future ancestors and looking back towards our ancestors, and how are we creating a space that draws on the resilience and wealth and assets and of folks that we're coming from and that we're building into together. And I really appreciated how you wove all of that together. And then none of this work is neutral. You know, someone in the Aaron in the question asked about how we don't sort of clash with family teachings that might go against this more critical approach. But every approach is coming with a bias or a set of political values, right? So if I walk into a classroom and say, I'm the teacher, this is how it is, and it's going to be like that, I'm putting that agenda out there. If I walk in and say, this is about love, it's about inclusion, it's about working against the system, even if we're inside it in a classroom, that's another agenda, but they're going to clash with something, right? So we come with our own honest thoughts of where we're coming from and recognize that positionality. And I appreciate you guys for that. And I also just want to say, even as you're dismantling some institutions, you're also working, I'm thinking about like the program, Torie, that you lead in CGU. So for those of you who don't know, Torie directs this program. It's a master's program, and we have some of the students in that program here, which is in community engaged education and social change. So how do we change our institutions, our higher education institutions, to be talking and doing these things that we're talking about right here, to live in this conversation? You want to live in this conversation with Torie? Get into that program, man. You get to have years of this, right? Building together. To think about how do we change what our masters are in and jobs we want to get and the work we want to do, right? And so we've been doing this work. Someone's talking about doing this work, you know, forever. And how do we continue to evolve it, change it, and think about the abolitionist framework and the youth-centric framework. So you guys have given us so much. I'm very grateful. If folks want to continue to get involved, Iman has a wonderful presence. Iman is Youth Mentoring Action Network. They have a great presence on social media. They have presence, you know, obviously in so many different places. You can catch up with them. And you can also continue doing the work in collaboration through CASA. We can connect you to them. And again, like I said, through Claremont Graduate University. If there's anything else you guys want to drop that people should know, if they want to keep this up, if anything, final words of wisdom and departure, like how do we stay with you guys in this conversation? Anything, Torie or CADE?
All right. Yeah, just really quick then. So for all of us, right, as young folks, in-betweeners, wherever we're at in life, elders or aspiring elders, just always invest in a young person. You know, you don't have to go into youth development work per se to become like a mentor, become like a youth development person. Just, you know, pick that young person or have them pick you and just engage, you know, and create, just always be thinking about creating networks, right? Collect folks, you know what I mean, in the most respectable way possible. Collect the folks in our communities that do amazing, you know, beautiful work, and put them, you know, to work with yourself, with young folks in your community and stuff like that. And just always be thinking about that, creating a more holistic, more engaging community that's healthy, vibrant, abolishing toxic structures, all that good stuff. And we can't do that without a diverse network of folks. So that's the key part, the networking. you know, piece of Iman. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate y'all.
Just saying thank you and love y'all and hope to build.
I want to say one last word. If you really are down for this movement, it is outside of the system. One way you can make an like very tangible difference is not make, you know, Torie and CADE go to traditional places for funding so they can do the radical work they need to do. So you can just give your own dollars. If you have 25 cents, you can give that. But they're working supporting Black young women in this time in this moment, but always. They do this before it was trending, and they'll be doing it forever. So you can give your money, you can give your time, you can give your energy, and as CADE said, you can do it right in your own families and of course with the organizations. Thank you all so much. Everyone join me with some snaps, with some love. You can take yourself off mute, you can hoot, you can holler, you know, we can just say thank you very much for this. We love you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.